days recently. Something funny happened to me this week. My wife, who's here today, gave me a call up, and she explained how the college she worked at had ordered some cupcakes for an event that would be decorated to celebrate Black History Month. It turns out the company made Valentine's decorated cupcakes instead. And I swear, for a moment, I thought the company refused to make Black History decorated cupcakes because they'd be considered DEI. Just for a slight moment. Turns out it was just a miscommunication, and she brought in some Valentine's Day cupcakes for everybody to enjoy today. But it just goes to crazy how things are these days. For a brief second there, I thought how silly society has become. But today I want to discuss a mode in my life where a non-Buddhist reminded me of one of the reasons I am a Buddhist. As I mentioned in the previous Dharma talk, the past 2 years have been difficult for me in my personal life. Some of the problems were out of my control and some were self-created. As some of you may recall, I've spoken about my struggle relationship with my son. No matter how hard I try to connect with him, I fail to develop the kind of bond that most fathers would want with their son. In some ways, I come to terms with the fact, obviously my preference was to have a strong and lasting relationship with him. I learned to accept that, although we may not be close, my primary role as a parent was for him to develop into a kind, gentle, and responsible contributor to society. As time passed, our relationship remained distant. This was a very difficult period for my family. However, in many ways, my wife and son maintained a strong bond. I'm happy to say that he has a promising future as he begins his journey as a young adult. I still struggle internally with conflicted feelings. And he and I still have not spoken in a long time. Throughout this period, I faced a lot of internal turmoil as a result of resentment, frustration, anger, and guilt. As I spoke in a past Dharma talk, I unfortunately distanced myself from my practice the exact time when I needed it the most. I became less mindful, meditated less, and at times found other unhealthy ways to avoid my problems. Fortunately, I was counseled by Reverend Grace Song, and she guided me back towards my practice. She put a different perspective on things. She taught me to look upon him through a different lens. She pointed out that he was struggling with his own demons, and I should look upon him with compassion and empathy. This really struck home and helped me back on a path towards enjoying life again, even if it was not going as I planned. That being said, even though I had made my peace internally, there was still no external connection with my son, even though he had given indications that he was open to it. And if the subject was brought up, I would express that he would have requirements before I accepted him fully back into my life. Although I'd seemed to let go of my anger towards him, I still felt that he needed to earn my respect and love. I thought I deserved an apology. I deserved an apology. Wasn't I warned to expect that? It's the least he could do. He had to earn my respect and love. I should not be expected to just ignore what happened in the past. That's just how it was going to be. Then when asked about the situation from someone whom I respected, I described my requirements for a reunion. After a long talk, she then asked me something that seemed out of the blue. She asked me to describe Buddhism and why I was a Buddhist. I responded with the general basics, Buddhism focuses on loving kindness, compassion, meditation, and the practice of letting go of your ego. She responded, so tell me about that concept of letting go. After a brief pause, I admit, a tear began to well to my eyes. I looked up at her and said, "You son of a gun," though I used a little bit more colorful language at the time. She revealed through a simple question my hypocrisy. It was right there in front of me. It was time for me to let go. Let go of my ego, my resentment. Let go of my sense of superiority. It was either that or quit being a Buddhist. I figured letting go of my negative feelings towards my son was probably more beneficial than giving up Buddhism. She reminded me during this time, he was a child. He was a child. And although some may dispute this, I am an adult. What more powerful message could I teach him, than one of unconditional forgiveness? Did I expect him to get on bended knee and beg for mercy? Before this moment, the answer was yes. Last week, Reverend Kim said something that struck me. She said, we must keep in mind the warning not to fall into the realms of suffering, lest we find ourselves in despair with no way out. How could I expect forgiveness for my mistakes if I was not willing to do the same? Unconditional forgiveness was my way out. It was at that moment that I broke down and felt like I was breathing for the first time in years. It was relief. I once read about a master and his people were walking through a valley. The master pointed to a large boulder on top of the mountain. He said, "Is that heavy?" The student said, "Yes." The master replied, "Not if you don't pick it up." It was time for me to put the boulder down, because the boulder was one of my own creation. I allowed it to be real, and it was crushing me. Buddhism teaches that joy and happiness arise from letting go. We should take inventory of our lives. There are things that we hang on to that are really not useful and depriving us from our freedom. It is important to find the courage to let them go. I've always tried to have compassion and empathy towards others. My wife, my siblings, my friends, my students. The fact that I chose anger and resentment towards my son rather than empathy, compassion, and love is something that I'm not proud of. I was chosen to suffer, and subsequently, subconsciously, in a way, I wanted him to suffer as a result. There's a favorite parable I heard that states, centuries ago, a king once met with a Buddhist monk and demanded that he show him heaven and hell. The monk motioned for the king to come closer as if he was going to whisper to him the secret. Instead, the monk slapped the king across the face. The king jumped back and began screaming in anger. The monk simply responded, "That is hell." Once he realized what had happened, the king erupted in laughter. The monk then responded, "That is heaven." Similarly, Jesus taught the kingdom of God was present in all of us, that inner peace and happiness comes from one's own state of mind. Buddhism teaches us that we must let go to avoid suffering. Attachment, self-identity, expectations, desires, the concept of impermanence. And lastly, past hurts. My role in humanity during this lifetime is a choice. Am I here to suffer or cause the suffering of others? I desire to make this little corner of the world a slightly better place. Happiness is so amazing. It does not matter if it's yours or not. As society grows great, and old men plant trees, the shade of which they will never sit in. It's time for me to plant a tree for my son so that he can sit in the shade. Thank you.
Great talk.
Thank you. Early on, you hit on something that seems to me to be almost universal situation. You said that when you most needed your practice, you abandoned it.
Mm-hmm.
So what insight did you gain from why does that happen to us? And what did you learn about what to do when that is happening?
Well, I realized, and it was Reverend Song that kind of got me back to my practice. I realized that when things are going great, it's easy to be happy in practice. You know, it's easy to sit and meditate and you don't have 5 million things going on in your head. And ironically, again, when things are clouding your head and things are not going difficult, that's when we need our practice the most. And it's just interesting, like human nature. Like thinking about, you know, if someone gets depressed and they go home and they just lay in bed all day, which is the opposite of what they should do. They should get out and be with friends and be with family and try and do that kind of stuff. But as human beings, we tend to, you know, fall into that woe is me, you know, life isn't fair, kind of thing. And, you know, I found myself getting that direction. But it helps having, it's amazing having these moments of whether it's Reverend Song or Reverend MJ or, you know, people in my life that just kind of point that out and point out my hypocrisy and remind me of what what my purpose in life is. Anything else? No. Thank you.